Hi, and welcome back to Good Distinctions. I'm your host, Will Wright, and Good Distinctions are the spice of life. Today, I'm joined by Samantha Stephenson. Samantha, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's wonderful to have you. Samantha, first, just a little bit for the audience. Who are you, and what do you do?
I'm Samantha Stephenson. I'm a Catholic convert, homeschooling mom of 4 kids. I'm an author and a speaker, podcast host. I think those are most of my hats that I'm wearing currently. So I'm happy to be here to talk with you. It's nice to get to have some grown-up conversation.
Absolutely. So you run a Substack publication called Brave New Us that also has a podcast, Brave New Us, and people can find that by going to faithandbioethics.com.
Yep.
So faith and bioethics, we're talking about reason and faith, moral issues, all these sorts of things. So I'll start sort of biographical. What got you into bioethics? Why bioethics?
Yeah, well, so I became interested in bioethics, well, earlier than I knew. I was always into like dystopian fiction and stuff growing up as a child, but I definitely didn't hear the word bioethics until I was an undergrad. And after I became Catholic, I started taking all of these different philosophy classes as an undergrad to try to understand. I switched my major to theology so that I can understand my faith more, and then also one of the best Catholic professors at my university was a philosophy professor. So I started taking all of his ethics classes. And my last semester, he had a class called Contemporary Bioethics. And so we would read all of these essays and about things that philosophers were debating and academics. And I was like, really? Are people actually talking about these things? And then some of them were not so crazy. So the crazier end of the spectrum would be this one of these articles we read, for example, is on post-birth abortion, which is just the permissibility of infanticide. Yeah, we should allow infanticide. We should allow post-birth abortion up to age 2. So that was one of the more sort of shocking essays. And then other stuff that I just hadn't thought about that was a little bit more mundane, like organ donation. Well, of course, like I thought, what are we going to listen to or read about in terms of organ donation? I mean, what's wrong with that? Well, there's a lot of things that you have to think about when you're going to cut open somebody's body and take their vital organs. For example, how do you determine death? Because if you determine that somebody is dead when their heart stops beating, there go all your heart transplants. How do you, if you determine it by neurological criteria, by brain death, which parts of the brain and how dead? How dead is really dead? You know, it's kind of like the Princess Bride. He's only mostly dead. So questions like that I just found really fascinating. And so then when I went back to my master's when I was teaching high school, I took all of the cross-listed courses in bioethics I could, and I loved it so much so that I actually ended up going back and doing a second master's degree in bioethics. So that's kind of how that happened.
Yeah, there's a lot of different things that touch on bioethics. I mean, a lot of people when they think of bioethics, they think of beginning of life things like everything related to abortion, or even like you said, like this sort of push to even say that infanticide is okay.
Mhm.
Which I mean, we can get into like the fact that those really aren't very different at all. It's
Right.
just size, development, location, all that. So, and other people might think, okay, well, let's look at the end of life, things like euthanasia, um, so-called death with dignity. I mean, this is becoming an increasingly pressing issue, especially in even north of the border in Canada. A
Yeah.
large segment of the government is pushing the MAID program. So it's much to the discredit of my homeland. I was born in Canada, so it
Oh,
makes
there
me
you go.
sad to see. I moved to North Carolina when I was 2, but a lot of my family still lives in Canada, and to see sort of this moral degradation is just, it's really awful. But anyway, a lot of people see the beginning of life issues, they see the end of life issues, but there's a lot of things in between. And I know that's something from looking at your content on the podcast, as well as Brave New Us on faithandbioethics.com. You spend a lot of time in that middle zone. So I know you're working on a writing project right now, and it's got a working title, so we might change, but like what is the working title?
Sure, yeah. So the working title currently is Resisting Dystopia: How We Are Unleashing Hell on Earth and How to Fight Back.
So very calm, very serene, very peaceful, sort of look at the world. So dystopia, I'm actually not even sure what the etymology is. I know that topia means city or place, right? And then what does that prefix dis mean?
Yeah, so when we think about dystopia, I think the etymology is going back to utopia. So Thomas More wrote utopia, meaning no place. So it's this idealized society. So that's like a utopia is a perfect place. Well, a dystopia would be the opposite of a perfect place. So if you think about dystopian societies, they're usually not places that you would want to be. The opposite. There's no nature. It's all dark and gloomy, and there are these various things that these dystopias have in common, like nobody reads anymore. I think that's because most of them were written by authors. So nobody reads. The people. There's all these ways in which people are becoming less human, and becoming less human makes that society a place where people who are fully human can't thrive, don't want to live, and those kinds of dystopian societies help us to imagine or to recoil from certain practices. Okay, well, where is this particular practice leading us? What will become of us on a large scale of a human society if we pursue these different various ends? And so that kind of emerging research and technology is what I like to spend my time in. And one of the reasons I like to look at these things, so we can talk about what some of them are, but even just reproductive technologies, IVF, some of they're now becoming much more commonplace. When we look at those, we get to look at some of the questions that are, I think, the most fundamental, most important questions about our lives. Who are we? Where do we come from? What's the meaning of life? Those questions come up in a fresh, new context. So to be able to talk, they give you kind of an in to talk about those things with people where they might otherwise be pretty closed off to hearing what the church has to say about those things. And so that's a door to where we can actually evangelize about the good news, because it does, it sounds pretty bleak. It sounds depressing. But the point is that the good news is that we don't have to pursue these things. We don't have to live this way. We can actually flourish and live our lives in love. And so it's just another way of pursuing those questions and evangelizing the gospel in kind of a different way for people who might otherwise not be open to hearing it.
Well, and it's very clear that dystopian genre, that kind of subgenre, is very popular. I mean, there's a lot of people that watch dystopian movies or read dystopian books. I mean, some of the franchises in the last decade that have been the most popular would be classified as dystopian. I mean, why is that? I mean, what do you think's going on there? I mean, I know based on what you said, it's to find another way at the good and the true and the beautiful. I don't want to be cynical and I don't want to be pessimistic and say that people just like sitting in the dark, but like what do you think is motivating people to be drawn to these sorts of things?
I actually don't think it's because of the dark in them. It's because of that contrast. The closer the light shines even brighter in the darkness. And I think it's because everybody feels that hunger that we all have in common, which is this search for meaning. And when you look at these different worlds, like if you look at the Hunger Games or the Divergent series, I think those might be some of the ones you're referencing. Or bring some other ones up if you want. But those in those societies, like, well, what is the purpose of our lives? And if you just sit a bunch of, and then these are young adult series, if you sit around with teenagers, like, and you say, okay, guys, what's the meaning and purpose of human life? That's not going to open like that question will clam people up. But if you
Yeah.
say, here's an example in fiction, let's imagine this, and we can talk about these characters, and that opens up a window to be able to talk about what we think the meaning and purpose of human life is,
Yeah.
without having to make it this really overwhelming philosophical question. So we can put these characters on it and the situation and imagine, a brighter, better way of living through these fictional characters.
That reminds me of the way I started my U.S. history class last year. Very first class, I say to the students, are all religions equal and equally good? And then I have them discuss. They don't talk. I didn't expect them to talk. Kind of like you said, you ask them these big questions, and they're like, I have no idea. But then I spent the next 40 minutes doing a lecture on Aztec culture and human sacrifice.
Mm.
And then we come back to the question, and I say, are all religions equal and equally good? And they immediately say, obviously not.
Yeah.
Interesting. Talk more about that. And then they had this great conversation. So I think you're dead right on that. I think when we put it in different contexts, like you say, the light does shine in the darkness, all the brighter. I do want to talk about IVF though.
Sure.
So a lot of people don't know what's involved in that. And I think there's a lot of folks who say, well, it's just another way for people to have children who are struggling with fertility issues.
Right.
And so to be against it, sort of from a standpoint of not knowing anything about it, the church just sort of comes off, at least in perception, as being restrictive and mean, which of course is completely untrue. And but I'd like to go into what exactly is involved in that process, and why is the church opposed to it? Why is it against human dignity?
Right. Yeah. Well, and that you just said it right there. The church is coming at this from a perspective not of how can we satisfy these very beautiful and good desires for these families to have children. Obviously, that's wonderful, and the pain of infertility is really difficult. That's not a cross that we can minimize. But one way of thinking about the church is as the way we talk about her as a mother. We talk about her as the bride of Christ and as our mother. And as Holy Mother Church, she looks to direct us towards that which does help us to become more fully human and to help us on this road ultimately to becoming saints. And so when we're looking at practice and really any practice, but specifically taking IVF, that's the question is, does this practice help us? And does it help our dignity? Does it affirm our dignity, or does it undermine it? So that's the question we're asking. Does it help us in this way? And IVF undermines human dignity in a few different ways. So first, it undermines the good and the health of the woman. It undermines the good and the rights of the child, and it also undermines the goods of marriage. So we could take each one of those one by one if you want.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So if you're just looking at a woman and you're thinking, gosh, I really want to become pregnant, and this is not, my husband and I are struggling. First of all, I would hope, number one, to say that IVF is very, very expensive, and the way that it works, the mechanisms that it works by are using pharmaceuticals to hijack a woman's body and to sort of force it into things like superovulation, which is very dangerous when they're extracting the eggs. And that has anecdotally a high risk of cancer, but they're not doing the follow-up studies to find out exactly what those risks are. A very, very, very low rate of effectiveness. So they might quote you something like 30% per trial. So that's maybe $12,000 for each cycle. And the 30% is for kind of the ideal. It's actually much lower than that, especially if you are the typical IVF person who's maybe you're struggling with infertility because you've waited or you didn't get married when you were younger and you're trying for whatever reason you waited until you were later to try to have your family. Well, the rates for women who are in their 40s, sometimes the latest figure I just heard was down to 7% per cycle.
Yeah.
So very, very low rates of effectiveness. And if we were the FDA and we're looking at a drug and saying, like, should we approve this? Is this a good solution to this ailment?
Mm.
That those numbers would not be enough to get approval. But big fertility doesn't need those numbers because they can use the individual drugs for the purposes that they're designed for. You know, can this drug make a woman ovulate 60 times what she usually does? Yes, it can. So we'll approve that particular drug. But using these things in tandem to achieve a baby, that's not what they're looking at. So the other thing is, it's not actually treating the infertility. And so for every woman who is thinking about this, I want you to know that there is a solution that is much cheaper and much more effective and that can actually heal you for whatever it is. And that's not to say, like, it might be your husband's struggle. There's that too. But a lot of times, and in fact, 80% of cases, we have NaPro technology, natural reproductive technology, that could actually be used to heal the underlying causes of infertility. So whatever it is that is making it difficult for you to conceive, can actually fix what's going on. Another statistic, and we could throw these links for these studies and things in the show notes if that's helpful to people.
Yeah.
But another one I heard read recently is that 20% of couples who go through IVF will go on to conceive naturally afterwards. So that could be causal, could be not, but it's just something to be aware of. So when you're looking at, does this support the dignity of the woman? No, it doesn't support her health. It doesn't support her full flourishing or her. I mean, it's really this great way for an industry that wants to profit off of somebody's distress and somebody's really painful struggle. Well, we can commoditize that. We can make money off of that because we can promise, and so the rates of effectiveness have gone up over time because the industry has been able to prey on women's deep pain over not being able to conceive and bear children. So that's the woman. We can go on to the other, but if you want to,
I just want to make one comment before we do that. I love NaPro Technology, and just all of that whole field of research is fascinating to me. Because I remember there's many people in my life when I was in high school and college who would be prescribed birth control pill because of irregular or heavy periods, with no sort of even trying to find any underlying issues. And that always bothered the heck out of me.
I was one of those, yeah.
Well, and it's like, okay, so you're putting a Band-Aid on a bullet hole. Like, why don't you figure out what's wrong, or even try to figure out what's wrong? Because this is just kicking the can down the road at best, or at worst, it's actually causing serious problems later. I mean, the incidence of ovarian cancer and breast cancer linked to birth control pill is not negligible.
It's actually worse than a Band-Aid in a bullet hole. It's more like a bullet in a bullet hole. I ended up with life-threatening blood clots from birth control, the hormones that are in hormonal birth control. So the FDA is not listening, not willing to investigate the things that are actually documented. Naturalwomanhood.com. They have so much information there if people are interested. And it's not a Catholic website, although there are lots of Catholics who work there, but they're just totally dedicated to bringing the harmful effects of birth control to light and helping people, women, to make better choices that are, healthy for their bodies. So if they have a number of FDA petitions that they've filed, you can go and add your name, your signature to those petitions, but just to ask the FDA to be honest with patients in the public about what actually could come about after some of these medications.
Excellent. Well, so NaPro Technology is short for Natural Procreative Technologies, right? And it's not a institution so much as a way of approaching things, if I have that right. I'm not sure exactly, but
right. Yeah, I think
what sort of magic? Okay, so it's
Yeah,
associated with the Creighton method. So
it
I
is.
guess that kind of is getting close to my question is like, what sort of magic shamanness is going on here? Like you're saying that you can actually fix the underlying issues. Like it's not magic. Isn't it basically charting and then having someone who's
Yeah.
trained
Yeah.
looking at it?
Yes, it's not magic, it's just science. But it's a kind of science where if you can't patent natural solutions, so it is much less profitable to just fix something naturally. It's much less and it's also much less profitable to fix something surgically if you can get somebody to go through multiple cycles of IVF. So for example, just take my case. So the reason that I was on hormonal birth control growing up was because I had really painful periods, and they were so painful, like I couldn't do anything. I was debilitating. I couldn't go to school, which worked out okay because I was a good student, but I was down for the count at least one day a month, maybe two. Fast forward to when I'm engaged and preparing, my parish had this choose your NFP method day, and I found out about Creighton. And originally we were going to do a method of NFP, natural family planning, that looked at different factors in a woman's cycle and her body to figure out, well, when is she actually fertile? That was based, and I said, oh, we'll do the symptothermal method because there's like multiple measures there, so we could have like a large degree of control, which tells you something about where my mindset was going into marriage as a newlywed. Now 4 kids later, it's a little bit different, but at the time, like, we need to have as many measures as possible. But then I found out about Creighton through this parish fair, from fertility fair. Creighton has a medical component to it that contributes to these doctors who are trained in NaPro Technology. And so by charting what I was seeing with myself, and I had been to like probably 7 or 8 doctors at this point, and they could only give me hormonal birth control pills, which I was already on, or narcotics, which is a great thing to be on as a teenager.
That is
So
shocking to me, honestly. Like I shouldn't be shocked. I shouldn't be shocked. I'm talking about Canada. So like I have a relative who needed her gallbladder out, and they said, "Oh, we'll get you into surgery 6 months from now. In the meantime, just take narcotics."
Yeah.
For 6 months. This is not medicine. This is horrific. Anyway, sorry about that digression, but
it's terrible. I'm sorry. I hope that worked out in the end.
all good now.
Okay, that's good. I'm glad that has a happy ending. My story has a happy ending too. So within, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 cycles, my fertility care practitioner who I was working with to learn the Creighton method was able to look at what I was seeing in my body through my charting of it, and she was able to say, you look like you might have some signs of some, maybe like endometriosis or something. I don't know. Maybe you should go see the doctor at the time, Dr. Stegan. You should go see Dr. Stegan. She's a NaPro trained physician in Southern California. And so I went to go see her, and she looked at the chart. She's like, yep, this looks like endometriosis, just from looking at the chart.
Just glancing at
I
it.
maybe had 3 cycles on there, so it was not very long after years and years and years of suffering. So she said, we could fix this with a laparoscopy. There's not a way to diagnose endometriosis, which can be one of the things that interferes with fertility. It's like, we can't really see how bad it is unless we go in and do a laparoscopy, and then during that, if it's there, I can fix it. And so that turns out that was correct. That's what I had. She went in, she fixed it, and I was able to function again. I didn't have to stay home from work 1 day a month, which was huge. I still had a large degree of pain. It actually got better after I had children. And I know I have autoimmune disease, and the changes of my diet I have made, I've actually done away with my pain completely. And so I think that my lifestyle and the standard American diet was contributing a lot to the pain that I was experiencing from endometriosis. So that's a story for another time.
Well, but it supports your point that if we pay attention to our bodies and we actually have people who walk with us in that and say, not I'm going to give you a pill, or I'm not going to give you a sort of fix. I'm going to actually figure out what's wrong with you and help you make the changes necessary to listen to your body, because that's all it is. And then move forward. Like, obviously there's things that you can't fix with diet and certain other changes. but there's a great many things that we can do.
Yeah.
And the
There
fact
are.
that,
Yeah.
that doctors, first of all, aren't trained to address these. And like, it doesn't come up in med school.
Right.
I have some doctors and I've asked them about some of these things and they say, yeah, we don't cover that, unfortunately. Again, not surprising, because one of my best friends is a doctor and he said that they modified the Hippocratic Oath. They barely even cover prenatal development in conjunction with ethics. So they don't talk about abortion in an ethical sense. They don't even cover ethics really at all in med school, which is just, and this isn't like some no-name med school. This is like UNC Chapel Hill, which is one of the best in the East Coast. So like, that's problematic, to say the least.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, don't even get me started on the state. Like, we can do all of these things to, we'll train you in organic chemistry. That you need to know. But you're going to cut into somebody's body and you don't need to know the basics about whether that's okay or not. You know, that ethics basics of how do we treat people. Doctors could use some classes in how do I behave as a human person. Yeah.
So NaPro Technology, really helpful. And like you said, they do there are certified NaPro Technology providers that people can find. There's not many. I know in Phoenix, for example, there's only a handful. And by handful, I mean like 3.
They're hard to find. You're lucky you have 3. I live in the state of Idaho and we have 0.
There we go.
Yeah, we have a Catholic hospital, but the doctors there don't know what it is. So that can be difficult. I have a great episode with Dr. Monique Ribeiro. It was before I started doing YouTube, so it's audio only, but she does a great job of talking about her experience of becoming a pro-life OBGYN, and she would have thought that she was a pro-life OBGYN all along, but she gave up prescribing contraceptives, and so then she was out of a job, basically. She until she was able to learn this NaPro technology, and then the doctors who wouldn't work with her because she stopped writing contraceptives, they started coming and referring patients to her because she could actually fix their gynecological issues without just saying, here, take the pill. It's the one thing that we can give you that will mask all your symptoms, but not actually heal the underlying causes. So that was a really great interview.
Awesome.
I would recommend people listen to.
Excellent. And I'll find that and put it in the show notes as well. That'd be great. So the first step of sort of why IVF is improper, immoral, is because it's not good for women. Duly noted. What's the second?
Yes. The second is that it does not properly respect the dignity of the child. So if you want to look at the church's teaching on this, we can look at Dignitas Personae says, and it's talking here about surrogacy. It applies that the child has the right to be conceived, grown, brought up within marriage. And so when you look at something like IVF, you're taking basically the purposes of the marital act are twofold. They're for the unity of the couple and for procreation. And so contraception separates those things by ruling out procreation or attempting to. It's not 100%. But that's why it's wrong. It's making something less than it's supposed to be. Well, IVF is the flip side of that. It says we're going to take away the unity in this situation and just have reproduction, not procreation there. And it's inviting this third party to come in, this technician or however many parties to come in and participate in the really the commodification of the child. So that's the best case scenario. The best case scenario is if you're a child of IVF, you are a product to be bought and sold. And I do want to say at this point, all children are made in the image and likeness of God, all people. So it does not matter the method of conception. You are beautifully and wonderfully made. However, that doesn't mean that we are going to celebrate on a large scale this commodification of human life. And so if you are lucky enough to be a child of IVF, we are glad that you're here. For all of the other embryos who were not lucky enough to make it, their fate is either that they were lucky enough to pass pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, so they weren't just thrown away immediately because their genetics weren't good enough. So that's eugenics right there. They were lucky enough maybe to be implanted, but then they have something, if multiple embryos take, they put it more than can safely grow, usually in a woman's uterus. Now, sometimes different Christian churches have different teachings on IVF. So one couple might say, we just want one or we just want two embryos implanted. And they're willing to do that. It's a financial risk because they're much less likely to get any of that implant. But on the flip side of that, when they're implanting like 5 or 6, if too many actually do work, then they practice what they call euphemistically selective reduction, which is just selective abortion. Which one of these children are you continue to grow? Which one are you going to abort? So right there, that's obviously not good for the dignity of the child. Then we have all the other embryos who just don't make it. The couple achieves the child or the number of children that they wanted. Then they have all the rest that are frozen indefinitely or frozen for 7 years while they wait to be adopted. And we can talk about embryo adoption if you want. Or the oldest embryo actually that was ever adopted and successfully birthed, I think that just happened, and that was about 30 years between when this embryo was conceived and created and the child was born. So I think the article that I read said that the parents of this child and the child were conceived in the same year. So that's through embryo donation. Obviously, those weren't his original parents. So there are a lot of ways in which we are taking human life and playing God, and that's the problem with playing God. We're treating human beings as things that are to be bought and sold, and we know that no human being should ever be bought and sold. And then we could expand it. We could go a lot of places with this. We could go into the eugenics problem. We could go into embryo adoption. We could go all kinds of nooks
I'd
and
like to
crannies.
talk about embryo adoption, but I want to take a step back first and just look at what is the practical steps of IVF, technically speaking, how does it happen?
Sure.
Because I want to point out, as you're talking about embryos, we're talking about human beings. We're talking about human persons, because life begins at the moment of conception, and conception is where you have a fertilized egg. You have an egg and sperm, and they have united and become one organism. So we're talking about human beings. But anyway, how does that actually happen? Because obviously we're taking the unitive measure out of it. So this is happening in a lab.
Yeah, in a lab.
But I have no idea how that works. So how does it work?
Yeah. So the woman in this could be the wife, or it could be an egg donor. So we could talk about those different instances. So, but you need a woman for reproduction, and you need a man. You need the woman's eggs. So the woman's given drugs that cause her ovaries to hyperstimulate. So normally in a cycle, a woman releases 1, maybe 2 eggs. That's how we get twins. And so these drugs cause her to have lots of eggs released all at once, so they can all be harvested out of her body, extracted, and so we take the eggs. It's got the woman's component. The man's job is this happens at the doctor's office. Usually, he's given pornographic materials to stimulate himself, and he masturbates. They take the semen, and that's the male component. And this could be from the husband. It could be from a donor. And so even right there on one of the my favorite lines that I've read about that is like, even the male act of IVF is distinctly anti-woman. Like everything about this is anti-woman. So that's those two biological components are harvested from the man from a woman and united in the laboratory, and then those embryos are frozen, preserved cryogenically until such time as they're ready to be used, which may be never. So the embryos eventually, like, they might be used, they might be discarded because they're tested for their genetic value. So if they don't meet the best of the best, those are just discarded immediately, and they might be frozen indefinitely. So we still don't know. There's always like a million frozen embryos in this country, and we don't know what will become of them. Will they all be donated to science? Will they all just be left to thaw? Will they travel down through the family like these strange heirlooms through this weird chain of custody? I mean, all of those things have happened and are happening, but for a million, that's a lot. And we're just creating more. So
that's awful. I mean, we haven't even gotten to the rest of it, but like at the very beginning, that's horrific.
Right.
That
really
sounds like
is.
something out of a dystopian science fiction movie. But this
It
is
is.
happening,
I mean,
and it's real life. Okay.
yeah, it is. And so some people, in their compassion, they want to respond to that and pursue something like embryo donation. So those embryos that are either no longer wanted or just have been abandoned by their parents, because somebody has to pay for their continual freezing,
Right.
for their preservation. So there are some people who say, well, the best thing to do would be then to take those embryos and to give them to families that want embryos and to adopt at that early age. And the argument there is like, well, I can obtain this child as early on as possible in their development, and then that child will not have, say, we can control the prenatal environment. We don't have to worry about what was going on with the mother's body at that time. We can give her the best foods, the best vitamins, no cigarette smoke, no drugs, whatever it is, which is very different from traditional adoption, which is where this child exists and adoption exists to give a child a home. It does not exist to obtain and to buy children for parents. So there's a pretty big distinction there. And so some Christian ethicists will say, yes, that's a good idea. The Catholic Church says that those embryos are actually in a situation of injustice, which cannot, in fact, be resolved because of the cooperation with the evils of IVF and taking that reproduction out of marriage, which is where it belongs. And so we can talk about that when we talk about the third component.
So what do you mean by did you say unresolvable, or it's not able to be resolved?
That's the official wording.
It's a horrible
I'll get you
answer.
the link to the document,
I don't like that.
But it says there's and thankfully I think that there's still like a little bit of gray area there, but it's one of those situations. Sometimes there are situations where there's no clear good option. And so I think that that's really what's meant there, is that we've created a situation for these embryos in which there's no way out that doesn't involve also committing some kind of further wrong.
Would that be the case? I just hypothetically speaking, just kind of on the cuff, haven't thought this through. Maybe you have. What about in the future? What if we develop, and I'm just literally throwing this out here to get your take. What if we develop artificial wombs that are able to bring the child to term?
Yeah, I'm actually writing an article about artificial wombs right now. So there are people who have suggested that artificial wombs might solve the problem of abortion, because if the goal in abortion, if the goal in abortion is really to end a pregnancy, but you could end a pregnancy without ending a life of the child, then that would be better, right? Then everybody would be happy. So I'm actually,
maybe. I don't know.
I'm actually doubtful about that, because I don't think that in a lot of cases the goal is to just end the pregnancy. And
No, I
in
don't buy
some
that at
cases,
all.
maybe that's true. But I think a lot of times the goal is to erase what's already been done and to erase the parental and genetic relationship that already exists. So I'm a little bit skeptical about that one. But the question is, so we have, our scientists have created artificial wombs that can bring lambs to life. So if we could have, that's a mammal. That's pretty similar. I think the most similar animal that they would test it on would be some kind of primate, but lambs is a mammal, so that's pretty good. So if we could actually mimic the maternal womb mechanically, which we already sort of do, right? We have incubators for premature infants that can take viability back pretty far. I think it might be 20 weeks, maybe earlier, but we've had babies that could survive that. That's halfway. So could we just extend that back? Could we get some better capabilities, and could we get viability sooner and sooner and sooner? Maybe someday we won't need a maternal womb at all. I think that that's very technologically very possible. I don't know how imminent it is. There is a large degree of hubris involved with many of the technologies that I look at, and I think this is one of them. We don't even know all of the components in breast milk. We don't know what these things are yet. And we think that we can mimic it with formula. Now we understand formula is great for when there are certain problems where a mother can't breastfeed her child for whatever reason. But it is not an equivalent substitute for the nutritional value in breast milk. And we could have a whole episode just about that. But the fact that we think that we could design some kind of machine that could replicate the maternal touch throughout, just that throughout pregnancy, I think it's incredibly prideful, and I think it would be a Titanic level mistake to try to do that. If you're trying to rescue an infant or a prematurely born infant, that's one thing. The mother's body is not there, and you're trying to save a life. That's something really different than
Totally different intention.
We're just gonna separate that and make that happen. So there are all of these studies that they did before they realized, hey, we should probably have some kind of studies about what we can and can't do to people in research studies that looked at the effect of touch on children in development and on infants. Infants die without touch. Like, they can be given everything else that they need if they're not picked up and held. Toddlers develop failure to thrive. These developmental milestones that they just miss, and then they never hit them if they are not picked up and touched. And so just that alone, we extrapolate that back to the prenatal process. I mean, I clearly have deep skepticism that we would ever be able to come up with an artificial womb that could appropriately provide for the needs of development in a way that would substitute for a mother if that were still an option.
I agree. I have nothing to add. I think it's just, even if I'm trying to, like, on one level, intellectually, I'm trying to say, okay, there's an unresolvable problem that doesn't really gel with us as human beings. We don't like those. We like resolution. And we've created this situation that is horrendous with these million babies, body and soul, just sort of frozen in frozen in storage. And the church is saying there is no resolution possible at this time.
I'm not sure.
Tough.
It is. I don't know that that it would be ethical to experiment on these embryos by, say, we had the technology and we could use the artificial womb. Could we bring these people to life? I don't know that's ethical to make them subjects of an experiment like that, and not knowing what kind of pathology we might be and trauma we might be subjecting them to on it. I just don't think we could justify that. And so I think that the closest, so this is not the church here, this is me, but the closest thing I have heard of a respectful way, like say, let's take this to a personal level, say that it's you didn't realize what was going on with IVF, you didn't understand the full ramification of, well, now I have 30 children that are in stasis. What do I do? How do I deal with this? Obviously, you can't bear 30 children into the world. Maybe you can't even afford to continue to care for them, or to the continued freezing indefinitely. There is an organization, and I found out about this actually from another interview I did with a woman. She's a Catholic doctor who has 3 kids from IVF. And so she kind of shares her journey and what she went through. And also I'll have to look up and send to you the name of the organization, but there's an organization that is dedicated to giving these embryos a proper burial. And so I think that is the closest thing that I have heard that can speak to the dignity of these human persons whose fates are otherwise frozen indefinitely.
Well, and withdrawing, if you call it, if we just stick to basic ordinary means of care versus extraordinary, I would say that keeping someone in cryostasis is extraordinary.
Yeah.
At least right now. I mean, we don't normally do that with people.
No,
It's
I
like,
think
you
the
have
church would
cancer? Hold
definitely
on,
not.
let's freeze you. We'll thaw you out in 20 years. Maybe we'll have a cure. Like, nobody does that. Maybe. I don't know.
There are a few.
But probably. I'm sure there are. It's like everything I say is like, oh, this is scientific gobbledygook. It's like, no, that's happening. Okay.
We can't go down some rabbit holes.
What a world we live in.
Actually, I forgot cryogenics. I forgot to put that on my list that I have here. But
what a weird world. But it would seem that it's extraordinary. And so it's like, okay, well, what are ordinary means of care? Generally speaking, it's like food and water. Well, you can't feed an embryo. Like it's just not possible. The conditions aren't there. It's not. And I think that your argument of or at least approaching an argument of like these artificial wombs wouldn't do it. It wouldn't be sufficient. There wouldn't be that connection. I think that would be ordinary means for a child in the womb. That's ordinary, necessary connection. And so if you don't have that, you don't have the ability to offer ordinary means. And if we don't have the ability to offer ordinary means, then withdrawing the cryostasis isn't inherently wrong. At least thinking out loud. So it would seem like letting these children die and then giving them a proper burial shows that we care about the dignity of the human person, no matter how small. And it seems like the only viable option here, ethically speaking. And I could be getting all of this ordinary, extraordinary means thing off completely. And oh well. So we'll leave it at this is Will's sort of ramblings that have absolutely no competency in bioethics besides like a class in my theology masters. So moving on from this, what's the third reason why IVF is
so
against dignity?
The third reason is that it does not support the unity within marriage. So we kind of already talked a little bit about the separation in the marital act of procreation and the unity. Another aspect that we can talk about is when, like I mentioned before, one or the other spouse goes ahead and reproduces without the other spouse. So that obviously there's a break in the unity there. And his Dignitas Personae, it's either Donum Vitae or Dignitas Personae, talks about that as essentially reproductive infidelity. Document doesn't use that term, but that's the term that I'm using because it's easier to understand than what the document says. And it says that when we talk about infertility, we don't talk about, morally speaking, we don't talk about one or the other spouse as the problem. We don't talk
Mhm.
about, we don't isolate. It's the couple that's infertile. Now, in medicine, it's helpful because you can hopefully heal those underlying causes of infertility. So it is helpful to know the problem. But if we're
Mhm.
going to talk about infertility, morally speaking, it's much more helpful to the unity and to carrying that cross in marriage if that's something that you're going through together. And if you choose to adopt in response because you desire to give a child a family and you guys want to live out your call to nurture your family together, adoption, you go through those trials, in equal measure together, because it is a difficult way to build your family. It's a beautiful way to build your family, but it always starts with some kind of trauma or loss, because there's a reason a child needs a family.
All right.
And so adoption is one way that couples together can seek to parent and to live out their call to fruitfulness. When one parent or one spouse leaves the other behind, so to speak, in reproducing, that causes a pain that is unique and difficult, and it's sort of hard for us to wrap our heads around it, because for the majority of human history, when anybody would reproduce with somebody who wasn't their spouse, there was sexual infidelity involved, and that
Mhm.
is easy for us to understand on an emotional level. We can empathize with cheating is wrong, cheating hurts, cheating is wrong. When there's no sort of sexual embrace, then it's hard to understand that pain, but we can understand it from people who are starting to articulate that it does leave anguish in their lives. Gabrielle Union talked about this. She said watching her husband have a baby so easily with somebody else when she was not able to was
Right.
like her soul felt like fine dust scattered in the wind. So it's hard because people who they're getting what they want, so they feel like, I asked for this, I consented, I signed up for this. So it's hard to even feel justified in articulating if you're going through that. When we look
Mhm.
at divorce rates, they are higher for people who have gone through IVF, and so that's
Mhm.
something to look at. Not that it proves anything, even just that stress. It's a really stressful process. Just the stress of going through that, I think, could contribute. So we can't really make any causal claims there, but it does, I think, bear further consideration, to say, what is it that we're doing to our marriages when we're choosing to leave the other person behind and pursue this option, and how important is that biology really in this goal that we want to pursue. Yes, our family, if we adopt, our family is going to look differently, we're going to face different challenges, but anytime you become a parent, you're going to face challenges that you didn't expect. And so I think the idea that we can control things to the degree that we think we can by choosing the genetics of our children, choosing even just the donor or things like that. I'm skeptical that those choices really give us the control that we think
Mhm.
they do.
Well, it makes sense that there would be a link, not necessarily a causation, but at least a high correlation between things like IVF, and I'm sure there's a whole other host of things that are correlated with divorce. Um, because anytime you have something that's high stress, high anxiety, and you don't necessarily do the work to come together, to be with one another through it, it's going to lead to far greater problems as time goes on. It's going to general attrition, or at least moving apart. So I know that the opposite is true as well. You can go through something very, very stressful, but if you draw close to one another in marriage, it strengthens you. You come out of it together, you even more together than before. I know that that was the experience that my wife and I had. We lost two babies to miscarriage, and through both experiences, I mean, it was the hardest thing we've been through, but there was a sense that we were in it together. We never felt isolated. At least I didn't feel isolated. I don't think my wife did either, to the point where we didn't think the other was not going through the same thing. We were both sharing in that grief together, and it brought us closer together. By no means perfect. We still work on our marriage and communication, and it's a constant coming back together. But I could see something like IVF where you struggle for so long with fertility, which is a hard thing to deal with. I mean, my wife and I were ready to have a baby immediately after we got married, and it ended up taking us 18 months to get pregnant. And that was a long 18 months, and that's not long compared to a lot of people I know.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, a year and a half when you're ready to go and it's not working, that's a long 18 months.
Yeah.
And so to have something like IVF come along and say, well, look, just pay, X amount of dollars, $12,000 a month or so. And then you'll have a kid. Look, exactly what you wanted. And then you start like putting all of these other issues in, like reproductive infidelity and these sorts of things. That's intensely traumatic, whether they realize it or not. And then I can't imagine what it would be like to have to go through seeing what happened after the fact. Because a lot of these folks, I don't think actually understand what's happening or like what they're asking for. So I just want to echo something you said earlier. Like, if you are a child who was conceived through IVF, like, you have no less worth than anyone else. And your parents are not terrible people. Like, it's not, I mean, I know a lot of people who are Catholic who have done IVF and had kids that way. And later on, they realize that the church is opposed to it, which I think is actually an issue from the church's standpoint. I mean, our leadership needs to do a lot better job. And by leadership, I don't mean just clergy, but lay people in ministry as well. Like yourself, like me, like actually saying something and saying, look, this is not okay, and here's why. It's it is horrendous. Just the thought of all of these embryos, these people, just sort of hanging out with no resolution. That's not what any of us were made for.
No, it's not. It's hard to talk about, though. It's hard to talk about these intensely emotional issues. We've somehow created a climate where if you talk about anything moral or ethical and somebody thinks or feels differently, or it's counter to the way that they have actually behaved, well, it's a personal accusation. And I don't know if that's an error of critical thinking, or if we just have raised people to be like, well, there are mostly everything is okay to do. There are certain things that make you an unacceptable person, like child rape. That makes you a bad person, but pretty much everything else is okay to do. So if you say anything else, if you say any behaviors are off limits, then that's personally angry. No, like we need to be able to talk about what we need to be able to talk about the kind of human future that our actions are creating. And so for us to say something like IVF does not uphold human dignity, or surrogacy especially does not uphold human dignity, that's out of love and concern for the dignity of all those involved for future generations. And it's important, and we need to be able to talk about it. And talking about it and saying that we're opposed to this practice that maybe person Y has done does not mean that we don't love person Y. It's because we love person Y that we need to talk about it. And it's not even just to say that we don't agree with this action, that this action is immoral. That's not to say that person Y is a bad person. We all do things that are immoral all day long. And I don't think that that's how, when you're a person who's faithfully trying to grow in virtue and going to confession often, you can see how sinful you are. I think that's actually a gift. But for the rest of the world, it doesn't take that time to think about, how could I have been a better person? No, just like we're all mostly okay and we don't need to talk about it. That doesn't help. So I think part of it is with our church, and part of it's just the culture that we've created. Being morally and reflective is easier.
Yeah. Well, self-knowledge is self-knowledge and self-possession are tough. I mean, they take virtue, they take time, they take reflection. Nobody likes thinking about themselves, really. Um, they like thinking about themselves in a good light, but as soon as you turn it negative, they go, "Oh, let's think about something else."
Yeah.
But that's exactly, like you say, that's exactly where we grow. Um, self-knowledge is the beginning of wisdom. So we're creating this dystopian world. Perhaps we're already in it to an extent. Out of all the things that you've seen in your research, this is a very broad question, take it wherever you like.
Sure. Okay.
What's the most, like, you saw it and you were like, no way, this can't, like, because we've talked about a
Okay.
lot of things that are
Yeah.
like, this can't be real, but like, what's one thing that you've seen that you're like, no, 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 that's a bridge too far, that can't possibly be true, and then you looked into it and sure enough, here we are.
It's actually kind of hard to narrow it down to just one thing. But so
Well, that's
I'm gonna
horrendous, but
I'm gonna give a
continue.
few. So we'll say these are the articles that came up. I have Google alerts for various keywords, and so these are articles that came up, and I thought I have to look into this more because this has to be like an Onion Babylon Bee situation. This has to be satire. This can't actually be research that's being done. So I'll just I have a list, so I'll just read a couple of them, and then you can go where you will. So creating mini brains from stem cells that developed eyes. 3D printing organs. That's a less crazy one. Okay, gametogenesis is creating eggs and or sperm. They've done this in mice, and you can actually take the stem cells, the adult stem cells of the mouse. At this point, if you're a researcher, take a female mouse stem cells, create female mouse, create sperm, and so you could actually have two female mice reproduce with each other, and you can do the opposite way as well. Chimeras, so they've been actually splicing human DNA into mice, or creating glowing rabbits with some of the DNA that glows in some of those deep sea fish that glow, that are luminescent. That one's kind of like a funny hat trick. Maybe that's
Yeah, that's
play on
fun.
words,
That's fun.
genetic editing. Okay, so rare good news.
Mm.
With genetic editing, they actually were able to cure a 13-year-old's incurable end-stage cancer, leukemia, with genetic editing. So that's fabulous. That's fantastic. That kind of experimentation, like last ditch resort, that's totally listed. Great news.
So what is that? Like, what is gene editing? Like, is there only one way of doing it, like with CRISPR, or are there other
there's actually
mechanisms?
they've come up with more besides CRISPR. First one is CRISPR. It's basically a technology by which you can, the way it's described to me, and I wouldn't say that I fully understand all the science of it. The way it's described to me, it's like being able to go into the Word document that is your genetic structure and pinpoint, the letter C on page 3 and take that out and replace it with the letter, like just like it sounds, editing, replace it with the gene that you want to see. So that's good. There are some uses for genetic editing that are not as good, or there are ways of doing it that are more or less ethical. So editing what is called germline DNA. So that's the DNA that will actually be carried on if those people reproduce in the future. So that is editing not just that individual organism, but every future generation. So that's much less ethical, because then you have all these generations of people who are essentially unconsenting subjects in a research experiment. Synthetic embryos. That's a good one. So they take sort of the stem cells and coax them into becoming the cells that come together to form a blastocyst and create, they sometimes call it, I forget the other terms. Most often they're calling it a synthetic embryo. If I see the other study. I'll send you that one. They actually have impregnated monkeys, primates, with synthetic embryos, and so they theoretically could do that with human beings, but they I don't think they will, because they don't want to admit that synthetic is just a word game that they're playing. Because if it looks like an embryo and grows like an embryo and has the DNA of a human embryo, well,
It
what
takes all the
else
wind out of the
is it?
sails of the abortion argument. Yeah.
I mean, it's hard sometimes to even to go through the research and think about it, because these are new things that did never exist before, and the scientists who are doing it, I think just because they want to see if they can, are not asking whether they should, and then they get to come up with the name that they call it. So it's been a couple of years, I think, since the synthetic embryo came, at least since that terminology started to be used. And now, only just now, are people starting to say, well, maybe we shouldn't call it a synthetic embryo, because that's not actually, it's not synthetic. It's just, it was, an embryo that was created not through the normal sexual manner of sexual reproduction. So maybe we should call it something else. So what should we call it? And it doesn't matter what we call it. It's still a human embryo. A lot of crazy stuff.
I'm not taking this out. I'm not going to edit this out, because I'm not very, I can't even speak. It's not very often that I'm actually speechless or without words, but I'm kind of at that point. I don't even know what to say to this. I've heard some of these things, and I literally pass them off as, no, that's Looney Tunes. Maybe it's something like National Enquirer, this can't be actually real, or this is things that people want to do, like you say, to see, okay, can we do this? Because there's nothing wrong with asking the question, could we do this? But as soon as you start putting it into practice, then you're doing something totally different. It's not a hypothetical. It's suddenly a real world scenario.
Yeah.
And the fact that it seems like some of these are actually, in their mind, succeeding, they're actually getting the result they're looking for. It's definitely kind of crazy. A couple of years ago, I will ask this question. A few years ago, I know human cloning was a big question, right? With after Dolly the sheep was created and seemed to actually, it worked. We made a sheep. The sheep didn't live as long as a normal sheep, and there was some other issues. But people immediately started talking about cloning and the application to human beings. And I know the church is very clearly saying no human cloning. In fact, it's one of the things that I have a little bit of a, not an issue with, but it seems very uncritical. In a lot of theological circles, you'll hear people talk about the Catholic non-negotiables, and Pope Benedict XVI had a nice list. There's another list that's normally sort of passed around, and two of the things that are on there are a ban on embryonic stem cell research, which is very clear why. I mean, you can't get those stem cells without doing harm to the child. It's usually through the process of abortion that they actually get the stem cells. But another one that's always listed is human cloning, as if this is off the table. It's non-negotiable. We can't talk about it. How close are we to actually having this be an actual issue that people will need to start talking about in public? Because obviously these scientists don't care what the Catholic Church says. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't speak on it.
Yeah.
So where's the line? I guess that's
sure. So first, just to speak about the embryonic stem cell research, I think it's true from a Catholic standpoint, from a pro-life standpoint, but it's also just true from a scientific standpoint at this point, because people have done it, that embryonic stem cell research has yet to yield effective treatments. It's actually the adult stem cells that are have actually yielded lots of exciting treatments. So I think that it's just, why would you ever continue to do something that's ethically questionable when you have something that is actually not just equivalent of an
but
alternative,
better.
but a wildly more effective method. So
Where are those stem cells taken from? The adult stem cells? How are they harvested?
So they're called induced pluripotent stem cells. So basically, you could take skin cells and take them and by this process that I cannot describe in detail, you can coax them into becoming, if they're pluripotent, it means they have the power of becoming many things. So you could encourage them to become the kind of cell that you want, which is the point of having these stem cells. That's why the stem cells are exciting, but you don't need an embryo to get
so
them.
Very fruitful results and incredibly non-invasive.
Right.
Sounds like a winner. Okay.
It is. Yeah, but it's a no-brainer. Why would you even if it were just to not have to fuss with all of the pesky ethicists and the people, like the societal criticism? Well, okay, yeah. I'll just do this other way that doesn't have any.
Sorry, one moment. Let me scratch my arm real quick. Yeah.
Okay, so on the cloning issue, there's a great documentary if people are really interested in doing a deep dive. It's called King of Clones. It's on Netflix, and it tells the story of this scientist who announced, and I think you probably remember this from many years back, that he actually had created the first human clone, and it actually was not true, was not accurate, but the scientist is still a practicing researcher.
Yikes.
And so it kind of like follows him. He doesn't see anything wrong with the kind of research that he's doing, but certainly animal cloning is, old news. And you can see in this documentary if you want. They've cloned hundreds of animals. I think the lab that they visited is in Dubai or some equivalent area. And so that doesn't seem to be as much of an issue. You can see all these cloned camels, cloned monkeys, this and that. And they were very excited about the monkey clones because if you can clone a primate, that's the closest thing to cloning a human being. So if we want to talk about why would human cloning be off the table? What would be wrong with that? So if we're looking at even just the dignity of that cloned individual, what kind of family does that person have? What kind of relationship? Who's responsible for that person? Who's that person responsible to? Who is that person in relationship with? The person that they're a copy of. One reason that people want to have clones is because you could then have a bioidentical organ donor. So somebody who has a child who has, severe need of a kidney might say, well, we were going to have another child anyway. So what's the problem with cloning the child that we already have and just taking that child's kidney? And of course, there's a big problem with creating somebody just
awful
as like this source of an organ for another person. So there are all kinds of way dystopian situations that you can imagine. What could you use a room full of clones for? You could give them the nicest facility. They could have these like game rooms, and they could have the best education and hang out on this clone island, and you can imagine all kinds of things. But how does that speak to the dignity of those people? A clone would be even more vulnerable than any human being who's born of parents, because they would have no relationships aside from the person that they're a copy of. And there's not a blueprint for what are your ethical responsibilities to your clone. So lots of questions hanging in the air about clones.
Yeah, well, it seems like the answer is very similar to like the child who is in an artificial womb. Like, there's no community, there's no human connection. We were made for community, to be in a family. And so I think a lot of these issues do come down to marriage and family, and just preserving that the individual is not merely an individual, but as part of something bigger. First a family, and then a community, and then broader society. So a lot of great things. I hope that we're not actually headed for dystopia. I hope that we can turn the ship around. It's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of work, but I'm very grateful for the work that you're doing with Brave New Us. And I do want to point out your book to everyone who's watching, Reclaiming Motherhood from OSV. You can get this on all over the place, but I got mine on Amazon. So
It's cheapest on Amazon if you're looking for a deal.
and Amazon is super quick too. Again,
Amazon
like
right
within
now
a day.
they have them cheaper than I can get them from the publisher at my author price. So.
Well, there you go.
Thanks, Amazon.
Yeah, good marketing. And it's so quick, the shipping. But definitely go check out Samantha Stephenson's book, Reclaiming Motherhood from a Culture Gone Mad. And also keep her in your prayers as she works on her upcoming book and work. Go to faithandbioethics.com to learn more about Brave New Us and everything that she's writing and putting out there. And your Instagram handle is
Real Samantha Stephenson with a PH.
There we go.
Stephenson with a PH.
Excellent. And for those watching, if you haven't yet subscribed to Good Distinctions, you can go to gooddistinctions.com to become a free or paid subscriber. Please do consider becoming a paid subscriber to keep all of this going. Lots of software and costs and whatnot. So please help me continue the work of Good Distinctions to, the mission of Good Distinctions is to reignite good conversations, find the best distinctions, and inspire others to do the same. And I feel like, Samantha, we've accomplished that, at least starting a lot of good conversations, hopefully.
Making headway.
Absolutely. And you brought up a lot of good distinctions. So I'm very glad to have you on the show. And maybe we can do it again sometime if you're down for that.
Yeah,
but thanks for coming on today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is great.
Wonderful to have you. All right. Take care. And I'll see everybody next week.